with one person only, DCK, David Christopher Kaufman, Senior Fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute, joining us. Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman, for your time. Day 101 of the war.
Day 101.
And on the one hand, global attention naturally, dragged elsewhere. On the other, there's, I would even dare to say, a standstill when it comes to the way the war is being perceived abroad, as in, no one's going to change their mind. This is it.
Yeah, I mean, we've reached this point now, I think, of a sort of existential status quo with this conflict here in the U.S. The battle lines have clearly been drawn between those in support of the administration's policies in Israel and continuing to fund, and those who are calling for a ceasefire. And so that really hasn't changed very much in the past few weeks. What I think is notable is that this is not a time for complacency. Those who are actively calling for a ceasefire, those who are actively supporting accusations of genocide on the part of Israel and South Africa and around the world, they are refueling, they're rearming, they're ready to take this to the next level. And I think that what's most interesting about the current moment right now is the way in which the global tide of anti-Semitism has really succeeded in a way that nobody ever could have possibly imagined here in the U.S. and around the world. In a sense, Jewish issues, anti-Semitism, the Israel-Hamas conflict has really infiltrated every element of the conversation right now here in the U.S. And although there are still plenty of folks who are on, our side, if we might call it, the fact that it is now sort of ubiquitous everywhere in the cultural conversation, everywhere in the political conversation, I think really, really exposes Israel, Jews and Jews in America and Jews around the world to a very big risk. I think we're entering a dangerous moment.
Yes, anti-Semitism to an extent getting a kosher stamp, right? It's a new normal in many circles. But while nothing's moving, David Christopher Kaufman, things are deepening. And one fallout you've been talking about is the growing divide between Black and Jewish Americans. We saw just most recently this appalling high school girls basketball match, but it goes far deeper than that, and also back in time.
Yes, I mean, I as someone who is both African American and Jewish, this is something I've paid attention to very closely my whole life. There's always been this sort of mythological affinity between Blacks and Jews in America. Jews and Blacks marched side by side during the civil rights movements. Martin Luther King Jr., whose holiday we celebrate today. It's actually a very vocal Zionist. So there's always been this affinity, but I've always contended that it was very tenuous and lacked a lot of support, because fundamentally there's huge and vast differences between African Americans and Jewish Americans, and it's always been like that. What this conflict with Hamas, Israel, and the growing tide of global anti-Semitism and also American anti-Semitism has really, really, really drawn battle lines between Blacks and Jews in a way that never really was spoken publicly before. It's unleashed a level of polite decorum or polite relationship that has begun to fail miserably. And you saw that very much during the whole Claudine Gay debacle when she was taken down from the president of Harvard. If you looked at leading Black intellectuals like Karen Attiah from the Washington Post or Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, they were very clear in the language they used, and they brought down Claudine Gay. A lot of they there, and the fact that kind of very pointed language, saying they basically meant Jews, even though they didn't say it. This would have been unprecedented, unheard of months ago. But at the same time, on the flip side, you also saw an unprecedented attack or focusing on DEI, on African Americans in prominent positions by Jews that also never would have happened before. So the gloves, we're not in any way near a race war, of course, but the gloves have come off and the fingers are being pointed. And very clearly, Jews and Blacks are pointing fingers at each other in a way that would never have been even imagined 6 months ago.
Yes, absolutely. You're illustrating it so vividly and so clearly. And you know, again, I'm circling back to conversations we've had different points and times throughout those 101 days, Mr. Kaufman, and the younger American generation, right? Especially the woke side of the divide has been, grabbing much of our attention. And I will rephrase my question. In general terms, young Democrats don't want the U.S. to intervene in any war, right? Young Republicans don't want the U.S. as a global policing force at all. So either way you're looking at it, the American perception, or the younger American perception of its own foreign policy is shifting.
Yeah, I mean, younger folks on the left, and this war between Israel and Hamas, and then of course the adjacencies with the Houthis in Yemen. This war has been, essentially popcorn for young people sitting at the movie of global politics. Because the young woke lefty folk don't want that America to be sort of a neo-imperialist, racist, neo-colonial, genocidal police officer, inserting itself into global conflicts where they constantly see, us as these great white oppressors, oppressing Palestinians, oppressing Houthis. Of course, don't forget that these folks who are being oppressed are, Islamist fundamentalist terrorists, but that doesn't really seem to matter. So they're very opposed to any sort of war that appears as if America is acting as a neo-colonial police officer, especially and particularly if those wars in any sense benefit Jews, which is what the perception is. The same time, on the Republican side, young people are less concerned about the optics, about the color of who's oppressing who or who's invading who. They just don't want the price tag. They don't really see it working. They don't really see it as in America's best interest to be funding billions and billions of dollars to conflicts around the world. Especially, I think, our disastrous or unfortunate performance in Afghanistan, 20 years, thousands of Americans dead, hundreds of thousands of Afghanis dead, and in the end we had this incredibly inglorious retreat from Kabul. So the young voters who are coming of age right now during this cycle, they saw kind of Biden's relatively disastrous pullout from Kabul a couple years ago, and are saying, do we really want to get back in there? Is this really worth our effort? We can't afford to, buy homes. We still have student loans. Like, why are we funding this? So I think that this is going to be, again, a very important issue coming into this election cycle, because young voters, millennials and Gen Z, are a massive demographic this year. They've been drifting to the right. We often think of young people as being particularly progressive, but in America they've been drifting to the right. But they're not jazzed. They're not excited about anybody. And I think that, as I was saying before, Israel, Hamas, DEI, affirmative action, all of these touch points that now involve Israel, they're ubiquitous in the conversation now, and they could easily draw young people in to taking a stand, to having to make a decision about what they think and who they support, even if they're not entirely sure.
And so the question is not who they're going to vote for, but whether they're going to vote at all. David Christopher Kaufman, Senior Fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute, not just providing the answers, but more so asking the right questions. Thank you so very much for your time. It's been a pleasure, as per always.